I undertook this project of explorations during the months of the pandemic, when, like most of us, I too voluntarily confined myself to home isolation and needed to keep myself engaged and busy with some meaningful work. For the last almost 50 years of my career as an architect and a teacher, I have been thinking about the nature of our work as architects beyond what the schools have given us, knowing fully well that there is an ocean of wisdom to be uncovered. I had just finished two books, and both the manuscripts are with my publishers. But even the best publishers are still struggling and reluctant to take up new projects in this difficult time of the pandemic. I was getting a bit frustrated that my work is not being placed in the public domain. A dear friend, she suggested, why not convert those ideas into a series of lectures? Thus was born this project. But I must confess that I cannot take credit for all that is presented in this series. Over the years, I have been helped by many fine minds, some contemporary, some not so recent, and many outright ancient minds who have left behind their life's work for us to draw from. I do not have words to express how indebted I am. You will see and also hear from some of them here. Converting written text to be published in the book form into a visual medium such as this presents its own challenges. This allows many more visual images, replacing text. However, many of these ideas are elaborated far more and in more details in the books. In fact, in that respect, both these mediums complement each other. Those of you interested in reading those books may look out for the following titles whenever they are published. One, non-aesthetic modernity. And two, sense of history, architectural representation of the idea of India. The series has 12 parts, each with a theme. The sequence does have some logic. Still, it is not necessary to view all of them in the same sequence. perhaps the first architect to have given some thought about the question of what attributes make a good architect was Mario Vitruvio, commonly known to us as Vitruvius, the first century Roman architect at the time of Emperor Augustus. We are all aware of his famous triad that architecture exists when three qualities are present in a building. One, formitas, the firmness or the structural stability; commoditas, the functionality; and venustas, delight or beauty. But that is about architecture, the building. He also had an interesting observation about what makes a good architect who may successfully practice this craft. This is what he wrote. Architects who have aimed at acquiring manual skills without scholarship have never been able to reach a position of authority to correspond to their pains, while those who relied only upon theories and scholarship were obviously hunting the shadow and not the substance. But those who have a thorough knowledge of both, like men armed at all points, have the sooner attained their object and carried authority with them, unquote. What Vitruvius is talking about here is binary. He's saying that the work of an architect is a two-faceted phenomenon, like a two-sided coin. On one side is the practical knowledge about how to put together a building, the craft of construction, which of course is acquired through experience. On the other hand, on the other side, he is asking for scholarship. Not the scholarship about the nitty-gritty of construction and materials, etc., but knowledge for the betterment of self and for the refinement of the mind. And he's also saying that anybody who has only one of these two qualities is only an incomplete architect. Neither only the practical skills nor the scholarship alone will do. About 1,000 years later, around 10th or 11th century, here in India, the great sage Maya. Now, we really do not know whether he was an architect or not, but he codified the best practices that have evolved through centuries and compiled a treatise called Mayamatam, in the opinion of Maya. In this book, he said something very similar to what Vitruvius has said in describing what it takes to be an architect. Shilpi Lakshanam. Bhavanti Shilpino Loke Chaturta Swaswa Karmabhi Sthapati Sutragrahi Cha Vartakashastakastata. Let me translate. In this Sanskrit word describes the four essential skills required for a successful erection of a building. These are the qualities of an architect and is expected to possess all, having acquired by having gone through rigorous training in all four stages. In the ascending order, these are Takshaki, Vardaki, Sutragrahi, and finally Sthapati, the architect. Takshaki is the laborer, woodcutter or stone cutter. But he's also not just a laborer, but one who, in this process, acquires the sense of the material, source or the stone or the wood with which he actually identifies the material that he's handling. Second up the ladder is Vardaki, the master mason or carpenter, who shapes the stone or the wood into walls, columns, curved balconies, or brackets. Third is Sutragrahi, normally the son or the top disciple of the architect, who has the comprehensive knowledge of the building and directs the workers. And finally, the Sthapati, the architect, High intellectual, moral, and ethical standards are set for the architect. He must be a man of high repute, physically sound, just and compassionate, famous throughout the land, and known to all communities around. Then comes in the fourth line, which I consider the most important part of this work. Stapati Stapanarya Sata Sarvashastra Visharada. He, to be a successful architect, should be well versed in all forms of knowledge. This is also what Vitruvius was talking about, scholarship. Not just the knowledge about the immediate task, but broader, what today we call liberal knowledge, for the betterment and refinement of self. But Maya goes a step further. He ventures into areas where Vitruvius had not gone. This is given in the last line. Ganitagna Puranagna Satyavadi Jitendriya. In addition to the technical and scholarly proficiency, an architect must also be committed to truth all his life and be incorruptible, beyond temptations. These are moral and ethical standards. But this was about 1,000 years ago. Vitruvius 2,000 years ago. Today we must ask, is there any contemporary comparable understanding about the qualities required of an architect and the nature of the work we are doing? 20th century has been particularly prolific about theorizing architecture. Thousands of books have been written by some great authors. And many great architects have also put down their thoughts, distilling their own experiences. Still, while they all speak truth, that is going to be subjective and partial truth. From their own point of view, based on their own experiences, I propose a different path. And for that, I would like to introduce one of the finest political philosophers of our time. In an ambitious project, Hannah Arendt has sought to classify everything that we humans do into three broad categories: labor, work, and speech action. She calls this vita activa. She has labeled the people engaged in the first category as animal laborants, the laboring animals, and those in the second category is Homo Faber, the fabricating human, or human the fabricator. She has not given a similar name to the third category, but since both speech and actions are activities that involves expressing oneself, I have taken the liberty to call this Homo expressor, the expressing human. Let us see where architecture and architect fit into this. Labor constitutes all activities of man that is propelled by the necessity of sheer survival and is located at the lowest rung in the hierarchy of human activities. The Greek civilization considered labor as falling outside the purview of the human activities and defended their practices of slavery by placing slaves at par with the animals who labor because they have to for survival and not out of their free will. This is what she says. What man share with all other forms of animal life was not considered by the Greeks to be human. And there is a very good reason for that. Labor does not produce anything of lasting value and does not leave anything as permanent presence. For example, This couple at the construction site does not produce anything tangible at the end of the day. They labor to help others produce something, but they are doing this to earn a daily wage, which they consume without leaving any trace at the end of the day. What labor produces from the material taken from nature goes back to nature without leaving any traces. The farmers produce grains, which in turn is transported to a baker who produces the loaf of bread, which has only a transient presence until it is consumed by you and me and goes back to nature in the form of excreta. It does not add to the lasting, tangible presence that constitutes a world around us. Work, on the other hand, produces durable things that constitute the man-made world. This man-made world, the home erected on earth, made of the material which nature has given us, consists not of things which are consumed, but things that are used. For example, people who erect the man-made world around us, such as buildings and even furniture, leave behind fruits of their work even after those who made them are gone themselves. But they have made, remain, and constitutes this man-made world, which we have erected between us and the nature. It is the work of human hands, which takes away raw material from nature and transforms them into new forms through the process of fabrication. Fabrication, then, the work of Homo Faber, consists in reification, that is, giving a concrete presence to an idea which itself has no presence. This process of fabrication is by nature and definition dependent on human intervention, unlike the natural process of decay and growth. And the end result of this process is the world we create, and which stands between man and nature and consists entirely on things we have made for our own use, not to consume. But unlike the objects of consumption, the product of labor, the things of this world are characterized by their relative durability, which makes them independent of man who produce them and use them. They outlast those who make them and become independent of the people who make them. This process can be characterized as from nature to culture. We take clay from nature and make bricks, which in turn are used to erect buildings, which constitute our cultural constructions. Same can be said of timber from trees, or cotton to fabric, and ultimately to our sartorial splendor, which also defines our various cultures. There is still an element of consumption contained in the term use. The object of use is invariably worn out, and its durability is relative. An apparel to be worn, for example, will have a shorter duration than, say, a building. But both of them are subject to potential destruction. But destruction, though inevitable to all things man-made, it is incidental in the case of use object, but inherent in consumption. Consumption presupposes destruction. The moment it is made, it is meant to be destroyed, consumed. That is not the case with product of use. But they do worn out after extended use unless it is preserved with efforts. There is a great deal of subtlety in Hannah Arendt's third category, speech action. While both labor and work can be carried out in isolation, you can live alone in a hut, grow your own food, or hunt and survive. Plurality, presence of others, is a necessary precondition for speech and action. After all, it makes no sense to say something while one is alone on top of a mountain if there is no one the speech is addressed to. Expression presupposes an audience. Therefore, both speech and actions are directed at others and are founded on the fact that each individual is a distinct and unique being, and it is this distinctness of each individual that is being expressed and communicated in one's speech and action. It is evident then that the existence of public realm is essential for this to happen. Only in the public realm that man can appear and express himself through speech and action. If destruction is inherent in labor and creation of the man-made world is inherent in work, as we have seen, it is this creation of the intangible public realm that is inherent in speech and action. The moment one speaks to someone, like in the case of at the Hyde Park, London, or performs an act of expression like a street play, or the sculpture of a twisted gun by Carl Friedrich Ruttersward to express the futility of violence, it automatically creates the public realm for this speech and action to be of any meaning. But ironically, this too does not create any tangible things, and the words disappear as soon as they are spoken. One is tempted thus to ask, is this like the product of labor which is consumed immediately? The answer is no, for both speech and actions have an enduring quality. We remember great speeches and great deeds for ages. Hannah Arendt puts it more eloquently, and I quote here, each individual in his unique distinctness appears and confirms himself in speech and action, and that these activities, despite their material futility, possess an enduring quality of their own because they create their own remembrance. The public realm, the space within the world which men need in order to appear at all, is therefore more specifically the work of man than is the work of his hands or the labor of his body, unquote. Profound as it is, still there is something in this statement that I find a bit problematic. The last line distinguishes the work of man from that of his body or limbs. Man, or more correctly, human, is here identified exclusively with his mind and given primacy over the body. This mind-body separation has been a fundamental principle of Western philosophy, but is not found in other mature civilizations. It has some grave consequences, but we will, for the present, suspend our disagreement with Ms. Arendt and see where this thought takes us. We will be forgiven to think that we are confused about where architecture belongs in this neat and elegant scheme of Ms. Hannah Arendt. Both speech and action are ephemeral. They do not last and do not leave behind any physical presence. But they are a powerful tool of expression. If architecture, or for that matter, all arts, is a medium of expression as we believe it is, then it belongs to the category of speech and action. But architecture is also the work of Homo Faber and constitutes the part of the man-made world. We have made it with our own hands and limbs. It should thus belong to the second category of work. How do we resolve this paradox? But it is not for her to speak about any particular activity like architecture. As a philosopher, she has given a broad overview of the vita activa. And while her study is profound and deeply rooted in her understanding of the human conditions, we will have to take it further to realize the nature of architecture. After all, it's a question of identity. We want to know what our buildings are. Are they fabricated places of occupation and use, the result of work, or are they works of art? This question of identity brings me to an ancient Greek paradox known as Theseus' paradox, or the sheep of Theseus, first recorded most likely by Plutarch in the 1st century. The story goes something like this. King Theseus of Athens built a beautiful ship with which he went far and wide on many adventures and battles, during which time the ship needed many repairs and many parts had to be replaced in the process. Upon his return, the ship was anchored at the Bay of Athens, where it was originally built. And for many generations, the Athenians preserved the ship as a memorial to their victorious king. But over the years, all the original wooden parts had to be replaced again as they decayed. The paradox is that when none of the parts was originally built by Theseus, is the ship still the ship of Theseus as it was always identified? At its core, this story raises the question of identity. How does an object acquire its identity when its materiality, its body, is dissociated from its origin? It's replaced. What remains with the origin? In other words, what is the original source of its identity? Aristotle provides a clue for us to resolve this paradox. According to Aristotle, the what it is of anything, its identity, comes from its formal cause, that which causes the form to be what it is. That is the design. That is the way its materiality is chosen and the body is assembled together. Thus, it is inseparably connected with the materiality, but is not the material body itself. The material parts can be changed or replaced during the process of preservation. But so long as the design remains unaltered, it retains its identity. Thus, it is the idea of the ship, conceived by Theseus. That is the source of his identity, and not the materiality of the ship itself, the body itself, which is replaceable. Philosophers have a way of saying things that may sound perplexing at times. I believe this concept of formal cause needs to be explored in a way that we can relate with in our day-to-day life. Here we have a bird, a beautiful bird we all know as chicken. That is its identity, chicken. It gets this identity not only from the fact that we are familiar with it as such, but also it looks different from other similar creatures. That is, its body is constituted in a way that is peculiar to chicken. That identity remains the same, even if parts are changed. For example, in this second chicken, when parts are somewhat different, the feathers are different, have different color, the crown is a little different, but it's still the chicken. The formal cause, the way the body is designed is the same. Now, if you compare it with another bird, which also has a crown, a more or less similar structure of the body, has feathers, but is not chicken, it is peacock. Because its body with similar parts is assembled with different design. At that point, you sense the chickenness of the chicken. That which causes the form of the chicken to be what it is, its identity. Science tells us that at the more fundamental level, molecular level, both birds share similar materials. And yet, nature has designed these, assembled the materials in a ways that make one bird a chicken and the other a peacock. You can say the same about tigers. The ferociousness, the stripes, the dignified, graceful, and confident stride with which he walks and patrols his territory in the jungle are all parts of the formal cause. Even when there are more than one tigers, and the bodies may differ from one tiger to another, but the design remains. This is again the formal cause called falling waters, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Like the ship of Theseus, this building too has undergone extensive repairs in order to preserve it. It was almost falling apart a few decades ago, and many parts had to be repaired or replaced. They rebuilt it exactly as it was originally planned. Unlike the falling waters, though, Barcelona Pavilion, designed by Mies van der Rohe, was completely demolished as its purpose, original purpose as an exhibition pavilion was over. All the parts were taken away, leaving only its foundation as traces. But soon realizing its significance as an important milestone of modern architecture, it was rebuilt using the original design and details of Mies. Now you may ask, what if you built the falling waters using the same design and details on a similar but different site? Would it carry its identity as falling waters? Like the second chicken or the second tiger? But then we immediately confront the issue of authenticity. Which one will be authentic and which an imitation or fake? This reveals a crucial difference between nature and culture. Formal causes of both are different. Architecture, being a cultural construct, is inseparably connected with the time and the place and the people who built each building, which is bound to be different than the others. Each building is a unique expression, as in speech and action, Hannah Arendt would say, of the people who built it and the time of its making. Neither of these two buildings could have been built in Renaissance. Both these architects, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe, having internalized the material, intellectual, and spiritual culture of Europe and America in the early 20th century, expressed it in their buildings. But that is not the only source of the formal cause. Both architects, though part of the same culture, were also unique individuals. And this uniqueness and their unique sense and interpretation of their culture also forms the formal cause, which gets reflected in their unique buildings. From the ship of Theseus and all the other examples we saw, we can surmise that an architectural object has two conjoined attributes: the material body and its formal cause, the design that determines the way this body is constituted. But wait, is this not what Leon Battista Alberti, the 16th century architect and polymath, also known as the Renaissance man, said 5 centuries ago? This is what he said. We consider that an edifice is a kind of body consisting, like all other bodies, of design and matter. The first is produced by thought, the other by nature, so that the one is to be provided by the application and contrivance of the mind, and the other by due process and choice, unquote. What a beautiful thought. Alberti makes a very important point here. He says the body itself has two attributes: design and matter. In other words, the formal cause and the material body of a building are not two independent parts, but are conjoined like two sides of a coin. In doing so, he also avoids the separation of the human body and the mind, as Hannah Arendt did. Remember, we disagreed with her on that point. This notion of the separation of body and mind has been one of the foundational concepts of the Western thought and was introduced in the 17th century after Alberti. Today, this idea has been universally questioned. Remember Vitruvius and Maya, with whom we began? The duality or dichotomy of design and matter that Alberti speaks about is not very far from the manual labor and scholarship of Vitruvius and the practical and the intellectual skills of Mehta. There is still one more question to be answered before we can conclude. If the idea and the building, the design and the matter, are two sides of the same coin, is a building, a material building, inevitable for the idea to be expressed? What about those great buildings which were designed but were never built? History is abounding with such examples. The works of Antonio Sant'Elia and Tony Garnier are two cases in points. Are these not architecture? Both these architects were ahead of their time. Their work did represent and spoke about the material and intellectual culture, but that culture was yet to be realized for another 100 years. It took us time to catch up with what they had imagined. These architects, and many others like them, practiced speech and action in its true sense that Hannah Arendt intended. Actually, they spoke and acted better through images, which was their language, the language of architecture and not words. We began with Vitruvius and Mehta. Both introduced us to a duality of architecture. Vitruvius talked about manual skills and scholarship. For Maya, it was the practical and the intellectual. We came across Hannah Arendt, Aristotle, and reading Hannah Arendt and Alberti together, we realized that architecture belongs to both the categories of work and speech action in the scheme of Miss Hannah Arendt. For Alberti, the duality consisted of design and matter. Now I believe we can conclude by articulating a contemporary narrative that explains our buildings and the work we do as architects in general. Architecture is an idea that is embodied in the building, not separate. The idea is the formal cause that determines the design of the building or its image. That idea embodied in the building lends the building its identity, authority, and durability.